Joining us now to discuss the issue of land that keeps on being debated in this country, Dr. Aninka Claassens from the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town. She was also on that panel led by the former President Ingonyama Trust looking at land. Professor, thank you for joining us. Let's start with Section 25. Do you think it's a good idea that the ANC tests it? It says that land can be expropriated in the public interest and subject to compensation. But do you agree with those that say maybe compensation can be zero? Maybe we don't need to change the Constitution?
Well, I completely agree that we don't need to change the Constitution. In fact, our panel, the high-level panel, recommended that Section 25 has a set of criteria to determine compensation, and it doesn't mention willing buyer, willing seller. Instead, it talks about just and equitable, and it talks about factors to do with what the land is being used for, how much past subsidy there was in the land, and how the land was initially acquired. So I think, as many other people have said, there are circumstances where it would be completely fair to expropriate the land without compensation. For example, in the instance of labour tenants who've lived on land for generations, but because of past racially discriminatory laws, weren't allowed to have recorded rights to that land. Now, when that land is transferred to them, there's no point in compensating the farmer because he never actually had use of that land. Those families have always had use of that land. There are also people who've held land speculatively in urban areas at times of great housing crisis and left the land vacant. And I think in those instances too, it's perfectly possible to expropriate for little or no compensation. I think what was really Sorry?
Professor, I was going to say there is a parliamentary committee looking into this whole issue around the Constitution, so it is getting a bit complicated.
Well, I think that committee is going to review whether, how to bring about expropriation without compensation, and also look at whether it's necessary to amend Section 25. And it's going to hold public hearings, and it's going to do that on behalf of Parliament, not on behalf of the ANC. So I don't see there being any kind of contradiction between that process going ahead and the ANC saying that it's beginning to come to the conclusion that it can start to expropriate land now and do so in certain instances without compensation. I think the key thing is that South Africans mustn't worry that this debate means that all land will be expropriated without compensation. That's not what is being discussed. What's being discussed is expropriating land for no compensation under very specific circumstances, but not all circumstances.
Something interesting, just before the land summit, the president was looking at an initiative in Gauteng whereby people get land, they don't get the house, they have to build the house, but that land is serviced. And it looks like he really likes the idea. Should this be upscaled? This is how we can release, presumably, a lot of the government land that's locked in government hands en masse.
Yes, well, I mean, one of the tragedies of our recent history is that the RDP houses have been built on the outskirts of the cities, and that has kind of reinforced the model of the apartheid city with the poorer people on the outskirts. And what we really need to do is release well-situated land. What people need is tenure security. If they have tenure security and they have service stands, people will they will make dwellings for themselves. So I think the key issue really is of this question of equitable access to land.
But what if you've been waiting for an RDP house for decades? Does government then give you the option? Will people accept just the land instead?
Well, sadly, people sell RDP houses for way below their value. And what people really want is well-situated land, because with well-situated land, you've got access to schools, you've got access to work, and you spend far less of your salary traveling to and from work. So my guess is most people would choose well-situated land over a house far away from work.
All right, so this is one of the options. The president saying you need a plethora of options. Let's look at the expropriation bill. The ANC does seem to want that passed. It went back and forth between the former president and Parliament. What's that all about? How important is it?
Well, I think what was discussed at the conference is that it is possible to expropriate land without compensation now. There are laws on the statute book that allow that to happen. And tragically, one of those laws is the MPRDA, the mining law, which is allowing not just expropriation without compensation, but confiscation of land without compensation from the poorest of the poor. And those are the people living in the former homelands, where unfortunately and tragically, most of the mining of platinum and other precious metals is taking place. So yes, there are laws already that allow for expropriation without compensation, like the MPRDA. There are also laws in terms of the Schools Act allows for it. MECs for housing have expropriation powers. But I think what they're talking about is a bill that would follow the provisions in the Constitution, because at the moment we're governed by an old Expropriation Act, I think it's from 1975, which talks about the willing buyer, willing seller. Now, the reason that the current expropriation bill was turned back was on the basis of insufficient consultation. So if they want to improve on that bill, which I think everyone wants to, they'd have to start the process over again.
All right, we're running out of time, so something I really want to talk about is the Ingonyama Trust, and I don't think traditional authorities, some of them not happy with the ANC talking about land tenure, with the panel that you were on talking about the fact that people who should own land as part of a community are having to rent it out. Just tell us what you found problematic. How do you get to a situation where people who ostensibly own the land are having to rent it themselves?
Yes, well, what our panel found is that there have been terrible failures in redistribution and restitution, and those need to be put right. But the biggest problem that we found is that people are being dispossessed right now. Their tenure security is being undermined. In KwaZulu-Natal, that has taken the form of the Ingonyama Trust inviting people to change their PTO certificates, which is a permission to occupy certificate, which is actually upgradable to ownership, into a lease agreement which binds them to pay rent, and a rent that escalates at 10% per year, and an agreement that says they forfeit the land and all the improvements that they built on it over generations if they don't pay the rent. So that really is something that is quite astounding. Fortunately, the Portfolio Committee, the Rural Development Portfolio Committee, has instructed the Ingonyama Trust to stop doing those conversions. It doesn't appear that they have actually stopped doing those conversions because the advertisements are still on their websites. But this problem is bigger than KwaZulu-Natal. It's taking place in Limpopo, Northwest, and Mpumalanga, where you have traditional leaders signing off mining deals on behalf of communities who haven't been consulted. And that matter is going to the Constitutional Court on Thursday this week, and hopefully we'll get a good judgment there which puts an end to that practice.
All right, thank you so much for your time this evening, Dr. Aninka, Professor Aninka Claassens, from UCT, and she was on that panel. And of course, we were talking about what the ANC Land Summit looked at. It can only make recommendations. Those will now be considered by the National Executive Committee of the party.